You're watching Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm thrilled to be joined again this week by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Connor Tomlinson Talk on the Lotus.com, and perhaps the most based priest you're likely to meet, an occasional writer for the European Conservative and the founder of Nazarene.org, a group that works on behalf of persecuted Christians, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, Father Benedict Kiely. Father Ben, thank you very much for joining us on Deprogrammed this week. So we'll kick off with some electioneering stuff before moving to more general matters. So Nigel Farage is being hectored by mainstream media at the moment for saying that a significant number of British Muslims, particularly young ones, alarmingly, hold views and attitudes that are completely anathema to our customs as a people here in this country. And as someone who's spent a significant amount of time in the Middle East, I would imagine that you understood what he was talking about a great deal better than many in legacy media.
Well, I've always said, thank you for having me, by the way, I've always said that the big question is not can Christians live in peace with Islam, but can Islam live in peace with Christianity? I think we already know the answer to the first part. The problem is that in most of the Middle East, which I know pretty well, Christians are in a very, very small minority. They're always second-class citizens. The danger will become, or maybe a long way on the horizon, where those of other faiths or no faith become a minority in this country or in Europe, and how will people be able to interact with that? I feel in some senses we're heading towards the French book Soumission, the Houellebecq book, that it's not there yet, but we've had candidates now already standing for parties, or they're not specifically Muslim parties, but if you come to this country, people were very rude years and years ago when Norman Tebbit gave his famous cricket test.
Yes.
But that's only, will you come into this country and take on the values of this country, keep your own values, keep your own traditions, but take on the traditions of this country that you say you want to be part of? And that's a valid question to bring up. It doesn't have to be polemic. It's a bit like in America, you know, the slogan for America is a pluribus unum, out of many one. And some wag said many years ago, there's a bit too much pluribus and not enough unum. And this is a part of the problem I think that we're getting here now, that if you push independent identities so strongly and then crush any opposition, we're heading for trouble.
That's an incredibly educated remark. Did you say a wag said that? As in a wife and girlfriend, a footballer's wife and girlfriend?
No, I mean a wag, like a sort of an intellectual wag.
Oh, I see.
You
okay,
know,
right.
yeah.
That makes a lot more sense. Colleen Rooney, all of a sudden.
Yeah, no, it wasn't.
really hot on her Latin.
It wasn't. No, she didn't do trivium or rhetoric, I don't think. But no, a wise, or I don't know what the acronym stands for, but a wise old geezer, maybe a wise old geezer said it.
All right, okay.
If I might, we were having a discussion a week or two ago now, and we were saying, you hear a lot of politicians talk about British values. Okay, so someone's being presented with something to assimilate into, but everything that the current Conservative Party or the Labour Party since Blair has put up sort of uniparty consensus of, this nebulous tolerance, multiculturalism, a sort of inoffensive assertion that we will bend over backwards to accommodate any outsider, and that's not really presenting anything to assimilate into. I mean, Eric Kaufman, mutual friend of ours, has said that's kind of like having the host of the World Fair, so you don't get your own stall, just be content with having the fair in the first place. So I wanted to ask to maybe drill down on what those values are, because are they just Christianity, because then is that a universality thing? Are they particular to England? Does that cut against the Christianity thing? Like, what's the interplay of those two?
Well, I agree with you. I think this has also become a problem in the last 20 plus years, that, for example, whenever there's a terrorist attack, it's always, well, these are not our values. And so the question is, what are our values? And if it is just tolerance, it's a serious problem. Our values are, you could say in the old-fashioned terms, we're Britain, England particularly, I prefer to speak about England. England is for 1500, 1600, 1700 years a Christian nation, a little bit of historical back and forth, but so the structure is entirely Christian, or even you could say Judeo-Christian. What our values are in a world that has kept those sort of structures but there's no force behind them is a very good question. Certainly free speech is one of them. free speech the ability to offend and be offended and not then put someone in prison. But no, I think you've raised a very good question, and I don't think at the moment politicians of either of the main or any of the main parties are really focusing on what that means, because it's a serious question.
I think as well these two questions are often allied, and this is why, though I think it's perfectly legitimate to talk about the need for people to be assimilating in terms of values, for example, and you give a great example there, and the Muslim community in this country, or Muslims worldwide, when coming to Britain, are going to cause the most difficulty in that department, precisely because the clash of values is so obvious in so many cases. And if you mentioned free speech, that would probably be one of the most salient ones. But it seems to me that it's also legitimate not just to care about certain beliefs and attitudes that people hold, and Christianity would deal with much of that, but also whether a person is likely to identify with the nation as their own. Not just do they like the values which reside in that nation, which they may or they may not, but can they see that, so to speak, their ancestors' achievements reflected in everything that they see around them, whether it's the Magna Carta, whether it's the Westminster Cathedral, whatever it might be. And I'm in favour of keeping these points separate. Questions of identity are legitimate to ask at the border, and questions of values, and I think that it's considered much more politically correct if you can couch your opposition to immigration, if you're going to be bold enough to be opposed to immigration, in terms of, well, let's do it to protect gay rights, let's do it to protect the Jewish community, let's do it to protect,
women's right to vote,
women's rights, all these sorts of things. And then I'm not against any of those things in principle, but the question is that all you're offering? A sort of anodyne values-based objection to the dissolution of your own country?
That's why I go back to America again. If you become an American citizen, you are technically meant to give up if you have any foreign passport, you're meant to give up all foreign powers and potentates.
Yes.
You're meant to become an American. The abbreviated Americans, I don't think that really started until the 60s, or you're African American, Italian American.
Yes.
And again, there's nothing wrong with enjoying your heritage, keeping your heritage, but you are meant to become an American. You identify with America from now on. You're not any longer, even though you may have a very strong accent, you're no longer from the country from which you came. Mm-hmm. And yes, I think if it was good enough for them, that's part of what it should mean to become a Briton, an Englishman, a woman, that you can keep a lot of your heritage, but yes, identification is with the nation state, which is perhaps why it's a little trickier that we are allowed to have several. I know people with 3 or 4 passports who are English, and you think, well, who are you identified with really? Are you the sort of the David Goodhart thing? Are you an anywhere person, or are you a somewhere person? And that's also a focus for us, I think, now. The vast majority of us, the ordinary people in England, are actually somewhere people, but we're not really very represented by anybody.
Do you think it's legitimate for concerned patriotic governments, if we can imagine such a thing, in Britain, is it legitimate to them to pay attention to the track record of certain minorities which might be becoming minorities in England when they're majorities in their own countries?
Absolutely.
Given your advocacy.
I do not want to offend anyone, and I can answer the question. You can live in peace with Islam quite happily, and I know good Muslims who live happily with us. However, I've been to Iraq 9 times. I'm certainly the only person in this room, and probably the only person watching this podcast, who's actually seen the building in Mosul which ISIS threw homosexuals off the roof. I saw it in the summer of 2018. I spoke to someone who that was the sort of Friday afternoon entertainment, to go and watch the homosexuals being thrown off the roof. So queers for Palestine better wake up. So yes, and I was with an Iraqi police general, and I asked him at the end of this, I was the first English priest in Mosul, lots of bombs still there, bodies and things, and at the end of it I was with an Iraqi police general who looked like he'd done a good bit of torturing in his time, had a dyed black moustache and dyed hair. Yes. And I said to him, General, what's going to happen? Because ISIS was still around. I said, what's going to happen to all the ISIS fighters who when they come back to England and France? And he laughed. And he said to my translator, they'll get apartments and jobs straight away. Well, he wasn't far wrong. So again, without wanting to offend, yes, we must be very careful with who we take. That's not a racist point. It's just common sense.
Right.
Well, so this jumps off the back of what you were saying, is that do you think there's a conflict? Because you wrote a very good piece for the European Conservative about can Christians care about demographics and national cultures. Do you think there's a conflict between the universal moral undercurrent of Christianity that everyone can recognise and the different national characters or the stories that different peoples tell themselves that might lead themselves to come into conflicts with one another? Like, do you think Christianity can overcome that? Because I think for some people it seems to be that they'll prioritise their national character, their historical identity over their Christian character.
That's also a very deep question. I think you can answer it by saying, I gave a speech a few years ago at the National Conservatism Conference asking whether you could be a Catholic and a nationalist. And I used the example, in fact, I know this is being broadcast on Thursday, but Wednesday is the 150th anniversary of G.K. Chesterton's birth.
Is it really?
And his biographer, Maisie Ward, said the whole point of Christianity is it's sacramental. In other words, it's very particular. So obviously English Catholicism, as it was and should be, is nothing like German Catholicism or Spanish Catholicism or African different branches of Catholicism. And that's all well and good. But then, as nationalists, we would never say, as a Christian, can never say my country right or wrong, because that then leads to things like Nazism. So it's a tricky question to be. I would just say, for example, if someone asked me, are you an English Catholic? I would say I'm a Catholic Englishman, the other way around. And that's not semantics, I think that's very deep and profound.
But I've noticed an immense naivety, and I'm sort of begging the question there, but I would describe it as an immense naivety on the part of certain Catholic intellectuals. And foremost in my mind here, though, I admire some of his work in the law, some of it. Adrian Vermeule in the United States saying that what we should basically have in the United States is that we should, because we want to, restore the United States of Guadeloupe, we should make it so that there's this is his quotation, a lexical priority in favor of Catholics at the American border. He said, and this would entail the whole southern portion of the American continent being open, because of Latin American people are overwhelmingly Catholic, and it would mean opening up the doors to huge amounts of people from sub-Saharan Africa, so long as they're Catholics. And that kind of naivety, this idea that our only criteria at the border, if we're going to have a sort of Christian state, our only criteria at the border can be, are you confessionally a Christian, flies in the face of all of those other concerns that Connor's talking about there in terms of national characters, certain histories. I mean, Christianity is in the Balkans, for example, so if you ignore the Bosnian element at least, which was predominantly Muslim, it didn't prevent Serbs and Croats from. I know that there's a sectarian difference there as well, of course, but it's not a perfect architectonic. It's not a perfect solvent in overriding these other identitarian national concerns. And it seems to me that Christianity should work with human nature, and if it's going to work with human nature, it needs to work with the intrinsic tribalism of human nature rather than deny it.
I'm not one of the so-called integralists at all. I think it's another wise young man actually said to me, before we start talking about Catholic nation states, let's actually have some Catholics. So let's have some people who are living their faith before. So that's far away and that's sort of a fantasy land. So no, I think it might be discussion in some rooms in universities somewhere, but it's not realistic at all.
Indeed, but you've noticed. You must have noticed. So I mentioned Vermeule, and for people who are wondering, that is Vermeule's legal philosophy, integralism. I mentioned Vermeule. Maybe he's a bit of an outlier here, but you will also get people like Patrick Dean, and I just meet loads of Christians in day-to-day life who think that if you're discriminating at the border for any other reason than are you Christian or are you not Christian, then that can only stem from a kind of racist chauvinism.
I think it's a minority interest like Tiddlywinks, really, integralism. It's not. It's just really, they're a very small group. They punch a bit above their weight, as they say. But the other thing we have to be honest about, is that there is a branch of Islam. I'm just focusing on Islam, but there are problems, as we know, with radical Buddhism and Hinduism. But there's a branch of Islam that agrees that it's perfectly all right to lie. So we could have hundreds of thousands of people saying they're confessionally Christian who aren't.
Exactly.
So no, I think that's a fantasy land.
That's the Abdul-Azidi case, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Converts to Christianity is giving out leaflets to get his asylum claim pass through despite being rejected in the sex offender, and then gets a Muslim burial as a good Muslim. That's fantastic. Yes, yeah, quite.
No,
but I obviously I don't want to cause any conflict here. But Pope Francis is also, I would say, softer on the question of the southern border than at least myself and Harrison are. Me as a long-suffering Catholic as well. His recent 60 Minutes interview, he did say that migrants should be embraced, that the door should be opened. I am concerned that there's an excess of charity happening there, considering other things are being overlooked, the economic arguments, the cultural arguments, etc.
You're being very polite. Excess of charity. Yes, my job isn't to criticise the Pope. I would say first and foremost, although he's the child of immigrants from Italy to Argentina, certainly Argentina hasn't experienced the sort of huge amounts of immigration, especially again from other cultures. And secondly, I would personally have a division between the word migrant and refugee. There's a huge difference. Once again, not semantics. A refugee is someone, man, woman, or child, who needs asylum, truly asylum, because they're in danger. The vast numbers, however sad it is that people are suffering economic difficulties, the vast numbers of people who are coming. I'll give you one example. I was just a few weeks ago in New York, in a parish right in the heart of the city, and the empty school was being used as a processing centre for migrants by the city of New York. And they were fairly loud and vociferous through most of the day. The vast majority were men, and the vast majority of those men were Africans, not Mexicans or Guatemalans. In other words, they had made the trip, which is admirable in a way, but they had made the trip all the way from Africa to get to Mexico, to get then up to New York, to then, by the way, the processing center was giving them tickets to go anywhere they wanted to go in the United States. That they are not refugees. Whatever else they're not refugees. And so, once again, the nation state has a right to control borders. I have a green card. I live in America officially, and I pay American taxes if this is going out in America. But I had to wait many, many months. I had to apply properly. I had to pay quite a considerable amount of money to get eventually my visa and then my green card. Perhaps I should have gone down to the border and swum across or something. This shouldn't be polemical. This is the problem. It's become so polemical because it's really about ideologies, as you know very well. And this is the problem. Different ideologies are pushing different arguments when refugees, we have a very clear policy and understanding. I would bring in, though, I've been doing this work helping persecuted Christians for the last 10 years. Both the United States and the United Kingdom governments let in a very, very small number of Christians compared to the number of other religions, particularly Islam, into both their countries. And under Trump and Obama, and under the last few governments here, a very, very small minority. And that's a problem as well.
I think as well, I think a lot of what you're talking about too reflects radically altered historical circumstances which the international community, such as it is, hasn't yet updated all of its legal provisions for. So when the UN Refugee Convention was drafted in the 50s, there was an implicit understanding that obviously if someone has a genuinely strong asylum case and they're in Eritrea or Ethiopia, they're probably going to try and seek asylum in Kenya. Not what they're not going to do is go up through the Horn of Africa, pay illegal smugglers to cross the Mediterranean and then shop around Europe like a kind of geographical buffet. But now, given that these people have iPhones, they know about the first world standards which prevail in these other countries, and they sort of obviously have economic difficulties as well. They can do that, and they can pay people smugglers for precisely those sorts of things. And so Ann Coulter's, who I spoke about last week as well, actually, she's spoken about this, how in the 19th century,
a very non-controversial person.
Yes, totally, sort of as milquetoast as it gets, Ann Coulter. She talked about how in the 19th century, immigrants into the United States were overwhelmingly more impressive and more successful than the host population that then resided there, because they genuinely they had to cross the Atlantic in the first place, so they've already shown a huge amount of doggedness in getting there in the first place, and B, there was no welfare state there, and sort of a huge amount of them actually went back to Europe. A huge amount of the Ellis Islanders actually went home. Those sorts of situations just don't exist today, and so governments need to update things
I
there
agree
as
with
well.
you, because can I make one of the things my charity does is we provide mini microfinancing for small family businesses. So now in 5 countries, in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt and Armenia, to keep Christians in their homelands. And that's something governments and the church could be focusing on a lot more about. Keeping people don't actually usually want to migrate. And for example, in Syria, I know that many Christians and Iraqis are returning from Germany, etc., to their homes, from Canada, because if they can start a business, they can be in their own homeland and survive and thrive. So governments could for example, the government of Hungary is doing this, focusing very much on keeping people in their own home. That's not, again, it's not a racist thing, it's give people help, and if they can, they'll stay in their home. You could shift the whole narrative, but
completely.
People don't seem to want to shift that narrative.
And what you're doing in that instance, Father Ben, is you're paying attention to 2 important facets of that person's identity. You're paying due respect to their religious faith and their right, their freedom to practice that religious faith. But you're also paying attention on a human level to the importance of identity for them as well. And again, that is the aspect that is so often missing here.
One thing that I will ask, I suppose this is connected to the dispossession of identity argument, is that, so building off of the idea of from the early 20th century, the migrants over to Ellis Island, like particularly the Italians and the Irish, they were Catholic. They had a denominational conflict with the WASP majority in America at the time, but integration was made a lot easier. Integrating into something is possible if you are shopping around with a sort of conscious love of the identity you're moving towards. And with Christianity waning from England, the either have no religion nor denomination, or Islam increasing, we're obviously not providing much of our historical values for them to come to. Do you have any hope of a Christian revival? I see the chuckle.
Well, hope is a theological virtue, optimism is not. No, in the short term, I'm not remotely optimistic. I think things will obviously have to get a lot worse before they get better, but you've hit, as before, you've hit on a very tricky problem, is what do we present, especially when we seem to be knocking down even the non-Christian values, our ancestors, our statues physically, if our entire history is awful and racist. So yeah, what do we offer them? We're offering them blancmange. I mean, I don't know what we're offering them.
And Rafe has a good line here. Rafe Heidelmann-Kuh, yes, our colleague here at the European, the New Culture Forum, has a good line in which he says that it's no wonder that young Muslim Britons living in this country, living in a very ghettoized diaspora, when the host population offers them blancmange, as you say, it's no wonder they cleave to the much more masculine culture of their grandparents. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you about as well, because it's a critique which I've noticed particularly setting in certain intellectual circles on the right. It's associated, I suppose, most of all in the modern world, although there are pagan precursors as well, pagan critiques of Christianity in the early centuries of this millennium, in the early centuries AD, to the effect that, and Nietzsche in the modern world is probably best associated with this critique, namely that Christianity has a kind of weakness for pathological altruism, a kind of an obsession with the weak, the vulnerable, the lowly, the poor, the unhealthy, the dispossessed, and that therefore, in this circumstance, and this is something which lots of sort of neo-pagan, anti-Christian right-wingers have said in the last 50 years, that Christianity has enfeebled Europe, and it has made us unable, as a very prosperous set of peoples on a very prosperous accomplished continent, it's made it very difficult to us to make these kinds of assertions of collective identity that would enable us to feel the confidence to police our border. There's this feeling that we just need to give me your poor, your meek. What do you make of critiques like that?
Well, first, that was a very pagan criticism, ancient pagan criticism of Christianity. The problem, and Europe was not enfeebled by Christianity. Europe was created because of Christianity. It's post-Christianism or Christianity that has now enfeebled. I can't give the quote properly, but remember T.S. Eliot said something. We're trying the experiment of creating or living in a civilization without Christian roots. I know I'm not quoting him properly, but he said we'll have to live through the experiment. Will fail, and we've just got to get through it. And what we're looking at and living through now is the experiment failing all around us.
Yes.
Christianity, yes, does of course care for the poor and the lonely and the enfeebled, but and I'm not arguing for muscular Christianity, although there's nothing wrong with that. But Europe, in all its forms, was created because of Christianity. And Europe without Christianity, the answer is, what is it going to be? We've got some unnerving things on the horizon of what it could be. I know your point. We were talking earlier about, our church is full of old ladies. Well, that's a problem. Nothing wrong with old ladies, but
that's not
you didn't say that. But I know what you mean.
Yeah.
That some people can feel that it's not a masculine religion, and it's a fault.
Yeah.
We've got to be aware that it's a return. We've also been through a bit of an experiment in the church. In my lifetime, I'm 61 in July, and really in my entire life has been that sort of experiment in the church, which, being completely fair and logical, without polemics again, is to say what has worked and what has failed. It should be fair to say now there are a number of things that have failed. We were discussing also before the show the recent pilgrimage to Chartres in France. It's an amazing thing that 20,000 mainly young people, mainly under 20, 25,
yes,
were on this walk, this 3-day walk in the wind and the rain and the sun to Chartres. That's a vision of Christianity which some do not like, but it's a vision of Christianity which is certainly healthy and certainly inspiring, and certainly if you get 20,000 young people doing it from all over Europe and even from America, that's pretty powerful.
I would just, another thing that I would add, because I'm very into boxing, and last week I was very impressed by Alexander Usyk. I don't know whether you've heard of him. He's a Ukrainian boxer who takes his Christian faith incredibly serious. And in his ring walk to fight Tyson Fury in the Undisputed Heavyweight Championship, the first one in 25 years or so, he came out to some sort of Ukrainian buzz music, but he was dressed as a kind of Cossack with a crucifix, a great big crucifix around his neck, and sort of doing the Orthodox sign of the cross.
And then he beat the living daylights out of
and then he won.
Yeah.
And so, this isn't just something for old ladies. Yeah.
No, far from it.
There are many UFC fighters that do the same thing, or the recent controversy around Harrison Butker, the kicker for the Kansas City Chiefs, who just won the Super Bowl, where everyone lost their mind when he was saying Catholic conservative family things to
he was
Catholic
saying
university.
Something that every Catholic would have agreed with 50 years ago. This is why I said earlier on it's about ideologies. There's a reason to try and destroy this and condemn it. And, no, Harrison Butker was just saying he's a family man, and he was saying what being a family man as a Catholic is meant to be. There's no big deal, but they made it a big deal.
Yes, but he also has the benefit of being he is a young man. Yes. He takes this seriously, and so what I tend to say to people who have this critique, I don't agree with the critique, but I've noticed it growing, and I do think it needs to be answered by Christian conservatives. I think that what needs to be said is that Christianity doesn't stigmatize these sorts of vitalist instincts that human beings have. All it does is try to order them towards higher ideals, rather than say that they're just purely there for your own enjoyment in the way that someone like Tate would want to assume. And
also we can say that, for example, I think it's fair to say now that post-Christian paganism is a very different thing from pre-Christian. Pre-Christian obviously had roots and had soil, as it were, good soil for Christianity to work upon, and post-Christian, the rejection of Christianity and the paganism that follows that is going to be, and is clearly already, but is going to be a far more dangerous and unpleasant thing than Christianity, than pre-paganism.
C.S. Lewis says the difference between a pre-pagan a pre-Christian pagan and a post-Christian pagan is the same difference between a maiden and a widow. And I think that's an opportune remark. I'd also quite like to quote something from Aquinas. He wrote a slightly lesser known pamphlet called De Regimine Principum, and he actually has quite a base remark about immigration, which I think it speaks to your point about how a lot of this is actually just these are sort of post-Christian bastardizations of certain Christian values that get taught out of proportion, and this shouldn't be associated with Christianity proper. He says, association with foreigners commonly corrupts the morals of the citizens, because men from foreign parts, nurtured on other laws and usages, inevitably behave differently in many ways from the customs of the citizens, so that civic life is disturbed. And that's a perfectly inoffensive remark. It's a perfectly true observation to make about human nature, and it's made by one of the most admired, probably the most admired theologian in all of church history.
Well, I won't argue with St. Thomas Aquinas. Who am I to argue with him? It could be interesting to develop that about a Frenchman and an Englishman and an Italian walk into a bar and who's offended who and who's corrupted who.
Quite
but
so.
we can leave it with St. Thomas
Quite
Aquinas.
so, yeah.
Well, I suppose the material change that gives me hope, not optimism, for I won't just say Christian revival. I will say Catholic, because it looks like the Anglican Church is dwindling and dying off as it weds itself to the prevailing thing of the age, is that, and we were saying this just before cameras started rolling, is that we've had a number of high-profile converts over to Catholicism just as of last year. So it's Tammy Peets and Ava Vladinger Brooke, Candace Owens, rumblings about Jordan from his inner circle, who knows when. I mean, he was just on Pints with Aquinas giving a very rigorous interview, so he's flirting with the idea, certainly. If he's around Jonathan Pageau enough, he might gravitate over to orthodoxy, but who knows. Whereas I think this has come about because of the internet, the rediscovery of tradition. Otherwise, the only avenue would have been your Anglican coffee morning with little old Lady Doris, which might not be the most inviting thing for a 20-year-old man who likes lifting weights or something. That's been the attraction of Islam via the manosphere. That's been the attraction of online Nietzschean vitalism via Anons on Twitter. So I suppose what's the marketing plan to bring young men back over to the church? Because it doesn't seem that there is one at the moment. Again, all the converts are women at the moment, for example.
You're right. Unfortunately, there are two quotes I like very much. I've quoted them before, and I like them very much. That the American novelist Walker Percy, the Catholic convert, but one of the things where he was asked, why did you convert? And his famous quote was, what else is there? Which I love, because that's very deep and profound. But the other one, he said at some point, I don't know if he was writing in the 70s, maybe slightly later, but he said at some point, young people, I think he's talking about America, but he can talk about the whole West. He said at some point, young people are going to get so sick of what's around them, the culture, everything around them, and they're going to come to us, meaning the Catholic Church. The point is, are we ready for them? Do we have something for them? Well, of course we have something for them, but I think you're right. Unfortunately, many in positions of power and leadership they're not aware of it. They have no plan. I would say, obviously, I think I maybe said it before, that we offer them truth, beauty and goodness, the traditional ways to God, and they will experience that in the liturgy. They should experience it in preaching, and all the other things associated with Catholicism and culture. There are people who are doing it in places, but it's piecemeal. But that is, when the church talks about new evangelization, of course it's old evangelization, it's just the gospel. But the church needs to have an awareness, exactly as you say, that people are obviously, I saw an interview with Ayaan Ali Hirsi as well the other day, and she was saying that people are longing, they're almost sick. They're almost at that point now of being sick with this culture, and they're longing for other things like community, etc., etc. But the church must be ready for it and offer it. Walking into a mass on a Saturday evening or a Sunday morning, terrible music or no music, terrible preaching, etc. God bless the priest, etc., etc. But it's not gonna do it. And I think those three converts in particular, Tammy and Ava and Candace, have come in because of a real pursuit of the truth, which is also very attractive, and we ought to be proclaiming the truth very clearly. But there's got to be the reason quite a number of people are converting to orthodoxy, for example, is because of that mystical sense of the liturgy and beauty We have it, but we've got to show it.
I think there's also one of the reasons why orthodoxy, just purely considered aesthetically, is more attractive to people who are flirting with traditional forms of faith, is that orthodoxy seems, and maybe this is something to do with language, seems to be less easily captured by the kind of homogenization of American culture around the world. And so one thing that I would say about, so I live in Brighton for my sins in the southeast, and there are lots of, again, God bless the priests, but there are lots of sort of happy clappy parishes there with sort of LGBT flags on the door, televisions being erected close to the altar, Christmas and Easter turned into a kind of pantomime,
And the churches are full, aren't they? They're overflowing.
No, they're not.
Well,
they're not, because
that was rhetorical.
I know it was, and the reason they're not is because this stuff exists everywhere else. So what, if the church is not offering anything fundamentally, at least hinting towards the otherworldly, then people, if it's just trying to imitate the world, then people are just going to live in the world. They're not going to live.
I was just
in
Wyoming, a Wyoming Catholic college, great college in the US. And we put a shrine for the persecuted in, but during a 2 hour long Eastern Rite Catholic Mass, all in English, mainly, or a little bit of Greek, etc., but chanting all the way through. But it was beautiful because it was translated into English, but it was very otherworldly. Everyone was full of young people drawn into this. The other option has I was saying earlier on, well, we have to see what we've failed at and what has worked. The other option has failed, and let's be just blunt about it and not condemn anyone for trying, but say that didn't work. What's going to work is bringing people to some sense of the transcendent. If the world outside is so miserable and bleak and grey, and you can have an experience of elevation in the Catholic Church, the priest actually says, "Lift up your hearts" during the Mass. That's elevate, be elevated. You won't be elevated by "Shine, Jesus, shine" and a pantomime. You just won't. It's just not going to happen.
It's very true, and it's a pedagogical technique, if pedagogy is the word, which has been adopted in many non-church contexts as well. I remember being at school and being in the music department, and I was sort of, the Great Awakening hadn't completely taken off yet, so I think it was sort of gathering steam. But I remember as I was leaving school, all of a sudden it was compulsory that Stormzy was going to be on the music curriculum, and I remember thinking, you do realise everyone's already listening to Stormzy. What they're not listening to is Bach and Mozart and Wagner, and all. So maybe rather than trying to meet the kids on their own terms, why not elevate them to higher terms?
Well, remember, we all know that great quote from Dean Ing, the Anglican, about the church that marries the spirit of this age will be a widow in the next.
Yes.
The other one, a bit more prosaic, is, if you put flared trousers on and think that's trendy, sorry, flared trousers were in 45 years ago. It's not trendy. The ute, they might be wearing flared trousers now because it's trendy again. But if you're whatever you're offering the ute is pretty likely to be long out of date already.
Yes.
Except if you offer them something that's 1,000 years old or something. Let's be trendy and archaic even. Let's make archaic great again, not America. We could have a MAGA hat, but it would be archaic, not America.
Yeah.
Why not? That's why I love this college. I was just at, because the kids are learning Latin, and they're not weirdos either. But because they go out and horse ride, they can shoot. I think it's the only college in America where you have to hand your mobile phone in, but you are allowed to carry a gun. I know everyone's going to scream now how awful that is. But it's about they live outside, they have this experience, and then they learn all the old books, and these kids graduate, they go on to get masters in other things or doctorates, and they're all highly, I think you know one of them, but they're highly intelligent, but they're being offered something which is really alternative.
Yes, and they're sort of total human persons as well.
Yeah, on the idea of the church trying to become just another buttress in the ceiling of what Curtis Yarvin would call the cathedral, the overarching superstructure of the current thing. time and time again on the question of this, on migration creating an anywhere class, I just keep coming back to those few lines on the Tower of Babel and just think, well, if you thought that this was an idea that, homogenization is going to go well for you, we're going to collectivize all one things into this system that's moving in concert, reaching up to establish heaven on earth, maybe read what happened to it as a possible warning for how those prospects will go for flooding people in the pews. One thing that my local church has done, wonderful priest who's very much on your thinking and that, is encourage more dads to come into the pews, because this is, if you want to invite young men, I think you need to represent them as in being making them present. And if it's just mothers bringing their kids to church, yes, a crying church is a thriving church. You want more kids being there, but the kids being kept controlled for an hour when it's quiet, it's very difficult for just a mum to do. It's not just easier for the whole family to be there, but if a dad is there, then it gives the young man who's looking online to go, okay, I want to return to tradition. I don't have a house and a family yet. I have something to aspire to. I look around me. Maybe I can build that out into the future. Do you see any other churches starting up men's groups or things like that? Or
100%. This is one of the ways. People who are doing this sort of thing in America, I know very well, but even in England, exactly that. Well, it's a witness for a start. The father, the witness of the father for his children, first and foremost, is huge. If dad's not at church, he's saying this is women's business. He's basically telling his kids this is women's business if mum's taking the kids. So it's a huge responsibility, which also, by the way, a father promises. We forget that in the baptism ceremony, the father and mother promise to teach their children the faith and to witness to the faith, etc. So that's one of the promises that for a married couple will be questioned about at the day of judgment. But yeah, it's very important to be encouraging this kind of thing and witnessing to the fact that the faith is. That's the difference. For example, in Africa, it's very much man's business as well as women's business. Has become, back to your original point about perhaps feminization, but anything that can be done to help men integrate their faith and live their faith is huge and very important.
As one final question, I suppose, if you're a sort of floating voter Catholic, general election has just been called, do you see anyone in public life at the moment representing an authentically Christian Catholic position? Because, for example, the Conservative Party were just proposing a vote on the decriminalisation of abortion. Labour's going to do something on assisted dying. I don't think many of the other marginal parties are advancing a Catholic social teaching on their respective manifestos. Are we represented in public life at the moment?
Oh, I fear we're back to the hope and the optimism question.
Sorry, I'm circling the drain with this one.
It's very sad. It's very, very sad. I don't think... I am a voter. I am a floating voter. It's extremely hard to put the X against somebody now. It could be, well, who's the least worst option, but no, I don't think certainly we're not represented by either of the major parties for deep reasons and deep beliefs. I don't want to finish on a point of depression, but yeah, let's build the faith again. But no, in the short term, not good.
Well, you'd often see as well, I just will make one more point, it's often the people who would be most receptive to Catholic social teaching at a political level would have been the sort of Labour backbenchers that existed in the 60s and 70s. Maybe they would have of Irish background, or they were from Liverpool or wherever it might be. They had that Catholic heritage, and their economic radicalism, if we can call it that, or their economic socialism was also tempered by a very important understanding of sort of, firstly, the importance of the nation, but also Catholic social teaching. It sort of exists in parties like the SDP. Could you not be a little bit more upbeat about that?
I could be upbeat about about minority parties, but the point is, who's going to be elected? That's the issue when we're still really dealing with a two-party or a three-party system. So yeah, in the short term, not upbeat. Sorry.
I tried my best. Well, listen, Father Benedict Kiely, thank you so much for joining us on Deprogrammed.
Thank you for having me.
Connor Tomlinson, thank you as well. You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.